Check. way the museum is focused on saving history is essentially by reaching out to the community and finding out what objects and also what stories are still available for us to collect and that we can properly care for within the space that we have.
The Clark County Historical Museum is viewed, well, a little bit as an unknown. People come in and they're like, wow, I had no idea this was here. It's been, we have to say, well, it's been here since 1909. Maybe not as a museum, but this building has been here forever and people still don't know. And when they get here, I think that it is not a typical museum. I think that they are blown away by the way that the exhibits are set up, the way that the museum interacts with the community through History on Tap, through our speaker series, through our walks. I think that it's really different for a historical museum because it's not just about the objects, it's about the stories.
I think one of the biggest challenges is that people don't understand how important what they have is. Often we hear, I'm not a leader, or my family wasn't important, when the reality is everybody who's been here has a story to tell that is important to how we've gotten to this place and who we're going to be in the future.
You know, as we continue to move into the future as an institution, I think what we want to see, the institution grow into is to become a facilitator of the community story in a much broader sense, to understand and respect the fact that we're a museum and we have a building, but really break ourselves out into the community where we're working with different organizations, working with businesses, we're working with government entities to help them both save their story and understand the best ways to do that, and then also work with them to help communicate that and share the narratives that they have. And so we're really looking at beyond the walls of the museum while also respecting and honoring the fact that the building is an artifact in its own right and the objects we hold are very important and key to our mission.
Welcome to this month's speaker series, brought to you by our series sponsor, the Historic Preservation Commission of Clark County and Wager Audio. This month, we're excited to bring you author and historian Jim Mockford for a presentation on Vancouver Marine Park boat racing in 1980 and tales from boating history on the Columbia. Our mission here at Clark County Historical Museum is to gather, save, and share the stories and memories of Clark County. The Society has been performing this mission for over 100 years, and here at the museum, we've been showing and sharing Clark County's history for over 50. The core ways we share Clark County stories is through programming, exhibits, and events like this one. Of course, we can't do this work without the support of our members. That's why this month, we've launched our 2021 membership drive. For the price of a night out, you can join us and help support our programs and exhibits. If you're already a member, help spread the word by becoming a History Ambassador. The History Ambassador that brings in the most new members will receive some great prizes. To learn more, go to our membership page on the website. Wander Clark County, our summer walking tour program continues. This August, we'll be celebrating Main Street throughout the county, starting in Ridgefield on August 7th. We'll then move on to Camas, Battleground, and then back here in downtown Vancouver for the end of the month. History on Tap returns virtually Thursday, August 19th, with a look at Indigenous knowledge and technology and climate change with Dr. Samantha Chisholm Hatfield. On September 2nd, we'll have two options for our speaker series. Our regular virtual presentation will be a discussion with Vancouver USA Pride President Michael McCutcheon. For the second part of our series, Pride, Conversations with Clark County's LGBTQ+ community. We'll also be in person at 5440 for the release of their limited edition can commemorating the 1970 Sky River Festival, with a presentation looking back at the festival by our very own Brad Richardson. More information on that and all our programs is available on our website, monthly newsletter, and social media. We're on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. And now to tonight's show. From early Indigenous Nations to today, the Columbia River has long been an economic and recreational lifeline for the region. In this month's speaker series, Jim Mockford explores the history of marine racing in Clark County, including a look at Vancouver Marine Park Hobiecat races of 1980. Jim Mockford is a historian and writer specializing in Asian and Pacific studies. He attended Waseda University in Japan, graduated from the University of Oregon Honors College with a degree in Asian Studies, and studied Chinese at the University of Washington. Jim has published essays on maritime history for several publications here in the US and internationally, including pieces for the Oregon Historical Quarterly and CCHM's annual publication, Clark County History. We want to again thank our season sponsors, the Historic Preservation Commission and Wager Audio, for their support. And now, on to Jim.
Hello, Clark County Museum, and thank you, Brad Richardson and April Busby and all the entire membership of Clark County Historical Museum for inviting me to come give a talk today about Vancouver Marine Park boat racing in 1980 and tales from boating history on the Columbia. I wrote my first essay for Clark County history back in 1991, and some of you may recognize the annual. And I got the privilege of working with Gus Norwood, who was then the editor here. And Gus encouraged me to write about Columbia River history, and that evolved into a three-part series for the annual in the early 90s. Okay, and that was an essay in 3 parts called Historical Currents of Trade and Transportation on the Columbia. And I thought a few years later, oh boy, I left something out. And what I left out of my series was mentioning the important history of boat racing. And so I'm glad that you invited me back today to talk about boat racing, because my own personal experience was right here at Vancouver Marine Park in 1980, and we're going to get to that. But I also wanted to tell you, when you look at the museum website and you see the theme of gather, save, and share, some of us are natural savers. So last year during the eruption of Mount St. Helens, I discovered this t-shirt. I survived Mount St. Helens 1980, a 40-year-old t-shirt, now 41. And at the same time, I discovered this old t-shirt from Vancouver Marine Park that I wore during the Hobiecat races of 1980. So that began my return to the river with another objective, which was to look into boat racing, recalling the fun that I had over 40 years ago. I decided I would try to call this A Tale of Two T-Shirts, but I've kind of changed it because we're not going up to the mountain today. We're going to stay on the river. And on the next slide, you'll see a map of Vancouver Marine Park, which really isn't that far from here. If you Google Maps from the museum, you'll go down to the river, it's about a 6-minute drive without traffic, a few miles away. And at this point, I went back to the river recently and realized that in some ways, that view of the Marine Park looking up to Mount Hood has not changed for the last 40 years. And there are many things that have changed, and we'll talk about those. But we should remember that the Marine Park and all the land around us was once Native American land. And when you get to the river, remember it's Native American water, a place where they set out in canoes to travel up and down the river to trade, hunt, fish, and even to race. Well, in my slide of Marine Park 2021, I didn't see any Native American canoes on the shore. I saw kayaks, I saw sailboats, I saw things that I recalled seeing 40 years ago. But fortunately, there's ways to remember what was on the river before that. And we'll start with prehistory, actually, with a legend of Multnomah Falls, the Wasco legend, that's recounted by Haven on a website called Gathering the Stories. And there were tales of a beautiful daughter of a Multnomah chief who had chosen her husband from the neighboring Clatsop land. And as was typical of the time, there was always an immense gathering for a wedding feast. And the wedding feast would last several days. There'd be celebrations and events. And on land, there were horse races and bow and arrow contests. And on the river, there were swimming contests and canoe races. So in the legend, we can imagine canoe races in dugout canoes that we see today up at Cottonwood Beach. And if you go to the Two Rivers Museum in Washougal on their website, you'll see pictures of that as well. But if you go to Marine Park, there's a kiosk, and in the kiosk, there's some illustrations of many canoes on the beach at Marine Park, which was once part of a densely populated Columbia River. And, you know, it was noted by Lewis and Clark, it was noted before Lewis and Clark, when Lieutenant Broughton came up the river, that there were villages on both sides and lots of canoes. Those explorers did not document canoe races, but it is part of a Native American legend that such things happened during wedding feasts. Well, I'm going to take you across the river from Fort Vancouver, from our side, from Marine Park, over to the south side for a moment, to what's now called Broughton Beach, named after the first European explorer to come this far by boat from the mouth at Astoria. And it was on that side there was another village, the Narachikiko village, which is near what we now call Whitaker Ponds. And the Native American Youth and Family Center is located in the round circle on the map, the bigger circle there. And the small circle on the map is where I lived when I was 5 years old. And in the next house, you can see our house on Ainsworth Street, and a picture of myself and my sister in the front yard, and my dad as well, and then another photo of my sister and I at the Ainsworth Street house just recently. And this is where my introduction to the Columbia River began as a 5-year-old kid, because my dad was out golfing in the yard you see here, and he did a big golf swing and made a divot in the yard. And there was a kind of a clink and a sound, and he saw something in the dirt, and he reached down and pulled out what he thought was a quarter and wiped it off, and lo and behold, you can see in the next slide, it wasn't a quarter. It was a Spanish coin dated 1777 with a hole in it, and as a 5-year-old kid, I was convinced we had pirate treasure in our yard, just like Goonies many years later came out with pirate treasure, except this happened long before Goonies. However, it was a big subject of conversation at Thanksgiving dinner that year, and my Uncle Stuart knew a woman, Vera Kreutzer, who wrote an article for the Oregon City Enterprise Courier, which mentions the coin, and in her research she knew about the Indian village just down the hill from where we live. So I was always interested in history, in the early explorers, both Spanish and English and Americans who eventually came to the river, as well as Native Americans. And in the slide that you see something more modern in Nessica Village here, it's a new building that remembers the tribe that is on 42nd Street today, a modern structure up the hill from where the old village would have been, now in the area that kind of moves out towards Portland Airport. So it's from this side of the river, the south side as well as the north side of the river, the Native Americans set out in their canoes, and from the south side on the bluff you can see Mount St. Helens to this day, an image that has changed since 42 years ago when the whole mountain was there for viewing. Well, we'll go from that to the first boat that was not a Native American canoe. And in the next slide, you'll see a photo taken of an English cutter, and that was actually built here at Grand House Folk Art Center in 1992 for the International Maritime Bicentennial, remembering the discovery of the river by Robert Gray, with the American ship that's painted here on the Astoria column. You'll see some Native American canoes in the illustration on the column. And then the actual boat built by Douglas Brooks, a boat builder who's pictured, he's shown as Lieutenant Broughton in this photograph, with a volunteer crew who rowed up from the mouth of the river at Astoria for about a week in 1992 and brought this boat all the way up to the place we are today, because it was Lieutenant Broughton that named Point Vancouver and also named Mount Hood and many other places along the river. And that reenactment was very memorable for those of us that were here. You can read about it in Quarterdeck and some other sources on Douglas Brooks' website. But I wrote about it myself in Oregon Historical Quarterly in an article called Before Lewis and Clark and Lieutenant Broughton's River of Names. And all these names were, of course, European names Well, they identified places that were important to the English on the map, and they failed to gather the names that were the indigenous names by people here who lived here. And so in some cases, people know some of those names today, but something was lost in the renaming of these places in order to put them on a map. Well, as the Americans and the English and foreigners of various types came to this area and Fort Vancouver was built, we had some bicultural people like young Reynold MacDonald, born in Astoria in 1834, the son of a Hudson's Bay Company trader and the daughter of Chief Comcomly's daughter Raven. And Ronald MacDonald attended the Fort Vancouver School in 1832 and 1833. And he was a witness to all kinds of boating changes that were going to take place during that period. First of all, the canoes that he rode in as a child were being used as burial canoes as the malaria plague impacted the river in the early 1830s, wiped out a large percentage of the tribe, and his own grandfather, Chief Comcomly, was buried in one. This is a replica burial canoe shown at Astoria. And then images of young Ronald, who eventually goes to Japan and becomes known as the first teacher of English in Japan. That's all another story that people have heard me talk about in the past through Friends of MacDonald. But in his book, he shows burial canoes that were here in the river in the 1830s. And then he leaves for Canada, where at Hudson's Bay, he runs into York boats. And York boats, you can see in these photos, could be fashioned with sail or used by rowers, as in the top picture. And today you do have York boat races where these York boats have been built, or replica York boats have been built, and they're used at the Treaty and York boat days. There's a great video on the link here. You can see York boat racing. And the Hudson's Bay Company then decided that York boats weren't just the right thing for the Columbia River. So they modified the York boat design and brought and built what down here in the Vancouver area, what they called Columbia boats. And when the Wilkes expedition of 1841 came along, Lieutenant Charles Wilkes of the U.S. Navy documented and described York boats, or Columbia boats, I should say. He saw the Columbia boats here and described them as having great strength and buoyancy. They carry 3 tons weight, have a crew of 8 men besides the padroon, meaning the master. They're about 30 feet long and 5.5 feet wide, or beam. The beam is the width, and they're sharp at both ends. And he goes on with a good description of this, because people who live around boats notice boats, and they notice boats that are different. And young Ronald MacDonald would have seen all these types of boats as he traversed the continent, and he came back in his older age as well. So he also noted that Columbia boats were admirably adapted for all the purposes which they are intended, and light enough to be transported over portages by their crews, and in case of accident are easily repaired. So Columbia boat was an innovation of the York boat done by Hudson's Bay Company here. Now, my research on boat racing has yet to find a good story about Columbia boat racing, but it would be logical that it probably happened, because you could hardly put guys in a boat, or have 2 boats around anyway, in which they aren't tempted to race. And so the next Hudson's Bay Company innovation happened not so long after young Ronald left Vancouver in 1834. Other changes started to happen on the river, and the Hudson's Bay Company steamer Beaver showed up in 1836 on the Columbia. So now we have a side paddle wheeler like the one here. Well, that one's the one in the museum here is a much more enhanced type of boat than the original Beaver that came here. But you see in the illustration, it was a simple side paddle wheeler, and it would be the first steamship to also sail into Puget Sound, where it visited Fort Nisqually. But before long, we would see all types of steamships, side wheelers, paddle wheelers of different types. They would be built to support the growth of American settlements, as American settlers came in increasing numbers during the century. And now we have another type of racing going on, because steamboat races happened all the time, actually, and were sometimes captured on film. or photos I should say, and later film and even reenacted for movies. So in the next slide, I have the Bailey Gatzert, which was named after Seattle mayor. It came down and was moved to the Columbia River in 1892 and operated many years here and was one of the fastest steamers on the river. And the captains would have steamboat races to pass each other on daily routes. They were in competition. They wanted to be known as the fastest steamboat. And often they got even more attention when there were events in the area, such as the Lewis and Clark Exposition of 1905, the centenary of the Lewis and Clark Expedition. So the Bailey Gatzert was on a twice daily run from Portland to Cascade Locks, and it even had its own tune, the Bailey Gatzert March. It was common for these steamboats to race each other, and it would take about 5 hours from the Dalles to Portland. So we have several things that are kind of important, really. The Lewis and Clark Centennial Exposition in 1905, but in Seattle they had the Alaska Yukon Exposition with regatta in 1909, and in the slide here you see they have motorboat races up on Lake Washington near what is now the UW campus, and there are boats from Portland and the Columbia River in the races in Seattle. And here they are racing in the Seattle Yukon Pacific Expo Regatta, as well as another photo of back here in Astoria at the Astoria Regatta. But a side note I noticed was this challenge from a native chief of an Eskimo village, Agkok, who challenged the Quinaults to engage in a canoe race during the exposition regatta. And the challenge was issued in Chinook jargon. So again, our local native tribes had an amazing impact on the region through language, the Chinook jargon, as well as they were known for the canoes of earlier times. And these canoes would still show up at special events, including the incredible Astoria Centennial of 1911. Astoria was founded in 1811, so for their centennial event, these photos show both Native American canoes in Astoria with steamboats in the background, motorboat races, fishing boats, and they were featured in Pacific Motorboat Magazine in 1911. And they made news up and down the coast to as far as like the Bay Area. Sausalito News carried this story. 30-day celebration at the Astoria Centennial with cash prizes of $12,000. That's a lot of money. At the regatta, there was a free-for-all championship. There was $5,000 in prize money for one event alone. And they noted that practically every coastal city will enter a boat or craft. And some came from as far away as Peoria, Illinois, and some were expected even from the Atlantic seaboard. In the Sausalito News article, they mention that this regatta will be decided the supremacy of fishing craft classes, sail-rigged hulls, sculling contests, tub races, canoe races between various Indian tribes of the Northwest, and such features as are usual at Western regatta tournaments. Now, by this time, there are such things as the Astoria Motorboat Club and the Pacific Coast International Motorboat Association, and their officials would direct these particular contests. Moving upriver to this area, Portland Yacht Club was originally the Willamette Motorboat Club, later Portland Motorboat Club, and then moved over to the Columbia River site in the 1920s, which is just across the way from Marine Park. And the current clubhouse that's there was built in 1952 after the original clubhouse had been damaged during the Vanport flood of 1948. So the oldest yacht club race was Portland Yacht Club, and they have a great website that describes their 100th year and the things they did during their 208th centennial celebration. But Portland and other yacht clubs on the river have had boat races of all types, both motorboat and sailboat races for many years. Well, looking into our region and its connection to Puget Sound, going back to the earliest days of both canoe trading from Chinook Indians to Nootka Sound and Macaw and others up and down the coast, and stories of war raiding parties by boat or canoe and canoes being traded, and kind of this regional a world of boating, and in some cases boat racing, from the earliest times, I became interested in various books written about boat racing around the world, or around our world. And this book just came out, The Boys in the Boat. You might have seen it. It's about the University of Washington crew that went on to win gold medal in the 1936 Berlin Olympics. And this is a great story. I would totally recommend this boat, and this book, and I also recommend the websites that describe it. But there's another website that has some information about a lesser-known story. And in this slide, you see the cover of the book here, but also a photo taken in 1941 of the University of Washington crew with the Swinomish paddlers that is well told in a YouTube video, which is Newt Berger's Mossbacks Northwest. And if you go to the slide and you look at this, you can see the faces of the Husky crew on one side and the Native American paddlers from the Swinomish tribe on the other side. And they raced each other in a goodwill race that the tribe suggested to bring people closer together from different cultures. And it's a very different culture to be paddling and facing the bow, and to be rowing, and having someone yell at you who's telling you where you are, and all you're doing is concentrating on the hull and on your crew. But they had fun doing this, and it's a story because it took place in 1941, that it was only a few months later that we went to World War II. And this story, remembered by some, was not told again for quite some time. So that's a great story. Both of those, the book and the story, connect both types of boats, both native and those of European origin. And now we're at the year 1941. Well, after the war, people went back to the river. Of course, we're busy here in Vancouver building ships, warships, of course, and the race is a different type of race, during the time of war. But fun returned to the river after the war, and we're not quite through with sternwheeler races, because in this slide you see the 1952 movie with Jimmy Stewart and Rock Hudson in a bend of the river, which filmed a steamboat race on the Columbia River between the Henderson and the steamer Portland. It was a publicity stunt. It wasn't part of the movie, although you do see some views of different boats, including steamships, in the movie. The race was filmed to promote the movie, and it was a 3.6-mile race that the Henderson won. Those who favor the steamer Portland will tell you it was rigged as a tugboat, right? The steamer Portland is really a steamer tug. So not really designed for racing other steamboats. But in any case, they had fun with steamboat racing, even in the 1950s. And now we're getting closer to the world I'm familiar with, because at the end of the war, typical boat racing, motorboats and sailboating and all that sort of thing came back. But also the surfer culture started. You may recall a movie called Gidget and the movies of the late 50s and Beach Boy culture, where people went to the beach to see surfing, but there was also a new innovation called the Hobie Cat that appeared. And the Hobie Cat was actually developed by a guy named Hobie Alter. He was a surfboard maker. He started catamaran designs in the early 60s, and the Hobie Cat itself was introduced in 1965. So before long, Hobie Cats could be seen here in the Columbia River, and everybody thought they were pretty cool. I was fortunate because my friend Doug Byers bought a Hobie Cat, and before long we were setting out from either Broughton Beach or Marine Park to go sail in the Columbia. Now, the two photos in this slide are not Doug and I. It was a good idea not to take a camera on board a Hobie Cat, because things happen and there's this tendency, especially when you don't know what you're doing, to capsize. So we see, though, from Adventure Sports Journal, some people sailing a Hobie as you hang out on the line, which was one of my tasks, and also capsizing, which we did in the Columbia off Marine Park. And thankfully, we're not too close to a tidewater barge, because they don't move. They just go straight down the river, and you don't want to wipe out in front of a tidewater barge. Anyway, usually races are conducted to avoid barge schedules, but Doug and I, with what little Hobie Cat practice we had, entered a race here at Marine Park in 1980. Now, 1980 is a year you remember as the year of the eruption of Mount St. Helens, and my survivor shirt I can proudly wear. So on May 18th, 1980, I was actually working as a steamship agent, and I was not on duty at the time, so I recall going out like so many people and just looking at the mountain erupt miles away. But in July of 1980, a subsequent eruption of Mount St. Helens caught me in this photo where I'm on the bridge of a Japanese freighter in Longview. So this picture is taken in Longview. You see the mountain erupting behind us. There's the Japanese captain and the river pilot, and we're on a log ship in July of 1980 as a subsequent eruption of Mount St. Helens goes up, and my hair is standing on end, which I actually had hair in 1980 to stand on end. So that was kind of a great picture to find. But it was just not too long after that incident that Doug Byers and I were scheduled to be part of this race. So now we finally get to the shirt, the t-shirt here. And you know, I didn't recall a lot of information being available, and in fact, Hotline magazine by the Hobie Class Association, which began in 1971, this Hotline magazine was actually a mimeographed newsletter at first, and it evolved to a monthly magazine. And by 1980, it had a color cover. So I found online the link to Hotline 1980, and in the regatta schedule, Division 4, it shows on the dates of August 9 and 10, Windjammers West, which is on the front of this t-shirt, Columbia River, Fleet 72, and a guy named Bob Reuter. Okay, this is an important name to people in the windsurfing world because he's a known person. A lot has changed in 40 years, so I was wondering what happened to Bob in 40 years, and I found him in the next photo. Here's Bob Reuter today, just earlier this summer. He's got a business called Gorge Performance in Portland. He was listed in that 1980 issue of Hotline magazine. And not too long after that, Bob goes up the gorge and becomes part of that original windsurfing community, and that is part of what's called the Gorge Blowout. And windsurfing then just takes off in the 1980s. So on Bob's website, you can see that he remembers the first year of the Gorge Blowout. He was a sweeper, and he used his Hobie Cat as a chase and rescue boat and dragged several board heads to shore. And he was surprised when I showed up at his shop wearing a 41-year-old t-shirt because a lot has happened upriver with windsurfing, and Bob's been very involved in that. I totally recommend you to check out his website and go see his store in Portland that has just recently reopened like everyone else here. Well, as a Hobie Cat racer who then went on to go do some other things, I was curious about other innovations that have occurred since our race of 1980. And in the next slide, you see something new that happened in the river since that time, which is the Columbia River Outrigger Canoe Club. And these pictures are of the 20th anniversary race around the island. It's a little bit upstream from here. They launched from the Oregon side at Chinook Landing. And you see the course. And in this one photo, actually a couple of these photos, you see the late Diva Yamashiro, who is a core part of our Hawaiian community here in Vancouver, and the Keikukui Foundation and people associated with the Outrigger Canoe Club would begin with aloha, the spirit of aloha, and a ceremony on the beach, including dance and song, that would then launch the race. And so we really miss Auntie Diva as part of the community of both the Hawaiian community here and our outrigger community in the river. But they continue to race outrigger canoes. In the next slide, we see dragon boats, which came to Portland in the 1980s through the Portland Kaohsiung sister city in Taiwan and became part of a Rose Festival tradition in 1989. And the dragon boats compete on the Willamette River for Rose Festival near the Hawthorne Bridge. but you can see them practicing on Vancouver Lake or even Ridgefield. And Ridgefield is sponsoring an event on August 7th this year that you can see in person, or check out paddleforlife.org to catch up on what that is all about, and how dragon boats are happening at more places and more times than just Rose Festival. So, outrigger canoes, dragon boats, and of course kiteboarding, in addition to windsurfing, some photos of kiteboarding, and a new thing called hydrofoils, where the foil below the board brings the surfer above the water, and even e-foils are in the area now, where an electronic propelled hydrofoil moves the surfer, even including Mark Zuckerberg recently in his photo of e-foiling. That is a new thing on the river. Now in my day, you would just hopefully have a friend that went out and bought a new boat, so you didn't have to do it, and he would show you how to sail. You didn't have the internet available to learn things ahead of time. You learned by trial and error and lots of error. You could take a class. There were classes in sailing here and there. But today you can actually go down to Vancouver Lake Aquatic Center, and they have a summer program just recently mentioned in the Columbian newspaper as part of their summer camp series. And you can learn, if you're 7 to 18 years old, you can learn to row, paddle, such things as rowing shells, like the UW Husky shells I talked about, canoes, kayaks, rowboats, dragon boats, and there's all kinds of summer sessions available to people that want to learn these type of boats, hopefully to race them. And you can go up to Hood River and learn the various windsurfing and foiling and types of things that you see on the river and you say, wow, I'd like to learn how to do that. And a lot of these communities actually do benefit racing. So kiteboarding has a Kiteboarding for Cancer a program where you can go to surfertoday.com and find out about that. Oregon Field Guide did a nice, there's a link here to their episode 8 about hydrofoiling. And when I started this preparation for this talk, I kind of thought I was a modern guy in 1980 on a Hobie Cat, and a whole lot of stuff has happened since that time. Well, before I leave, I want to remember my colleague on the river, Doug Byers. He was the owner of our Hobie Cat that we raced, and the skipper during the race. And he passed away a few years ago from Lou Gehrig's disease. He was always an outdoors guy. He's remembered through a fellowship by Signal Fire Arts at the link here. And you see him in a cowboy hat, which, he's the kind of guy that would have worn a cowboy hat while racing a Hobie Cat, except that, it's going to blow off in the wind, and there's probably a rule against fouling the neighboring sailboat by throwing things or letting things drift into the other guy. We were not quite so familiar with the rules, so I would say we might have had problems at the mark. Typically, you sail a certain distance, and these distances can vary based on the race committee. And there's a rounding of the mark and a coming back and a finish line. And when we got back to the finish line at Marine Park in 1980, we were just happy that we finished, that we didn't capsize. We were not among the more experienced sailors in the race, but it was a great time. And it was really great for me to go back down to Marine Park this summer to see what it's like today. And I encourage people to take a look at all of our parks here in Vancouver that are near the water. So I wanted to finish just by mentioning my slideshow does have a whole list of links to resources and places where you can go to find out more about all types of boat racing. You might be able to come to the Clark County Museum and see some of the exhibits of the maritime community. There's a canoe model over here, a paddle wheeler here, and some other items, including maybe this t-shirt in the future, which is now a historical item. So I want to say this is actually my first talk here in some time, and my first time to come back during the age of quarantine. And my project to do investigation of boat racing on the river continues, and I want to thank the folks at the Columbia River Maritime in Columbia River Maritime Museum in Astoria, the curator Jeffrey Smith, and the librarian there, Marcy Dunning, who helped me online, because Astoria, as the great city on the mouth of the river, has an incredible history of boat racing and the Astoria Regatta, as do other smaller communities all the way up the river. And as you go east to Pasco, where they have the motor hydroplane races and other things all the way up to the Okanagan country, the Columbia River has a vast area and a vast history of all kinds of boating and boat racing. And so we're just beginning to look into that here. If you have a story that you want to tell, contact the Clark County Historical Museum, find an old t-shirt in your attic or other artifact that relates.
I can hear
Okay.
you.
Sorry, I just got noticed that nobody could hear me while I was talking. So let's try this again. Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us. And thank you, Jim. And hopefully, okay, there we go. I just got confirmation that you can hear me. Technology is not my friend today. So Jim, thank you for a great presentation. I know when you pitched this a few months ago, we were very excited about the idea of talking about it, especially this time period, because we've got the Dragon Boat races happening in Ridgefield this weekend. So while we're waiting for those who are watching us on YouTube to pop their questions into the chat, I know you mentioned that you wanted to add or correct something, so.
Well, this has been fun to work with you, April, and Brad on this project, and I enjoyed coming into the museum, like my first time, since quarantine, just, recently when we did the recording. But I fat-fingered date in my slide that I could not believe I just got earlier, and I was just shocked. And that has to do with the birth of Ronald McDonald, who was born in 1824. I think the best of that was in 1834, but no, that's not correct. He was born in 1824 in Australia. We have to get that third note there that I messed up, not only in the slide, but I must have been reading the slide just now, because in that case, many years of talking about that particular hero, Ronald McDonald, William American in the land of Australia. I can't believe I had that particular error. But the other reason that's important is that a couple of years ago, he was born in Princeton, 2004. And so I suggest to rectify that. But we think that the association of President McDonald, and it won't be too long, I guess, if it's planning that far ahead, maybe at a time when we're all together again, as we did it throughout this lifetime without a pandemic. Really. But we want to make that correction. And the other thing I just wanted to say is, when COVID, I didn't get to interact with my
If you look at here, you're going to see April is conducting our first Thursday speaker series. I have to be super quiet or I'll really and Jim is answering questions on YouTube right now. So if you're not on YouTube, you're seeing that.
That's a good point on talking about the pandemic and how it's affected kind of everything and Thank you for the correction. Although, even here at the museum, sometimes we get our dates wrong, so it happens. So I guess I have a couple of questions, because I know when we were talking, we didn't go into as much detail about it, but when we were talking before the back when we were talking about the presentation originally, you were talking a little bit about like the time period, because when you're doing the Hobie Cat races, of course, this is during the time period that the mountain is erupting and spitting out ash. And can you talk a little bit more about that? Like, what is that like?
For people who race in boat racing, unless it's a straightaway, a straightaway from start to finish.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, this year with the pandemic,
Yeah, so definitely if anyone's looking for something to do this weekend, I believe it's their fundraiser races. this weekend at Ridgefield, which also happens to be Ridgefield's Old City Days, so their celebration because their birthday's coming up. So lots going on in Ridgefield, and it's fun. I got to see them 2 years ago doing the racing, and it was pretty cool to see them because dragon boats you don't see very often, like being in the U.S. unless you're in very specific areas.
Well, the problem with the variety of
boat racing that we've had over the history that we've got here is that you could go on and on about each one. And, from the arrival of the first dragon boats, which became over, in the 1980s, to the original boat, and seeing known people. I talked to a couple of them informally. They weren't quite ready to be interviewed for, their participation in dragon boating, because they weren't really sure what the future of their team was during this uncertain time.
Mm-hmm.
But when we were having the new club, it was really fun to see. I was happy that I was able to attend that event a few years ago. And I hope to get pictures of dragon boats, if not Saturday sometime soon. I'm not sure how close we're going to get to them or where we're going to watch them from. But any photographers, that have a good angle, I think it's good to see the sort of posters of the upcoming event. And then for younger viewers that are maybe boat racing themselves, you have some options that I did not have 41 years ago. And that is drones. People now fly drones over their boats to get some great shots. You see that in the world surfing, of course, but also in any kind of boat racing. If you have a drone, someone that's handy with a drone, that'll make for some great footage of your race. So,
but I'm kind
of surprised to be here after all these years talking about OECAT races because it was just something I did, at a younger age. It was a lot of fun, and I don't know if the video that was shown earlier, I think the YouTube video that showed my speed series, maybe only in passing, but that's now been passed over to the museum as a historical item because 1980 Vancouver Marine Park on the series. And maybe there's a few other features that people have in their collections that some interesting ways
involved in the past. So let the museum know.
Well, definitely. We actually have up our next exhibit, which is coming up in 2023, I believe, is actually going to be on sports recreation. So for those watching, if you've got anything or you know anyone who has anything, we're definitely going to be looking for community input on that one and community items. But yeah, no, and it's interesting that you talk about the changes that have happened. I mean, I grew up marine sailboating, so open ocean, and it's interesting to see the change just there, like just technology. You have access to things like drones and everything, which actually is really helpful. I have some friends who do crew, and they use drone to help record their teams so that they can improve. And it's a technology that other sports have had for a long time, but it hasn't really been available on the water because you don't want to bring a video camera on the water, right?
Right. Yeah, there's a lot of cool stuff going on. So, I was delighted when you
responded positively to the idea of a talk about boat racing. And there's a lot more I want to do with my story. Put the bug in the air and some other museums up and down the river. So obviously Columbia River is in ASTORIA, which provided some of the pictures I used. They have great history down there at the ASTORIA Regatta. But the yacht clubs in the river, in addition to the yacht clubs, there's a bunch of other yacht clubs who do racing as well.
Mm-hmm.
And then of course there's the Sea Scouts and other organizations, schools, training schools, way too much to talk about this. I had, literally a few things in my outline just to capture at least the gist of what I want to talk about this week. So,
Definitely. I mean, we have a quiet crew today, so.
Right.
But if anybody has any questions, by all means, send them my way. So that's outreach@cchmuseum.org, and I will get them to Jim and get answers out to you. I'll also be putting in the description for this video Jim's links that were in his slideshow. So they should be in by the beginning of next week. I'll promise that. But at that, I want to thank you, Jim. Like, this has been fun. It's been great to talk about something like this. I mean, this year we're talking about communities, and boating definitely has its own community that's really strong through the years. So thank you for joining us, and I hope we can see you again soon. I'm looking forward to see what else your stuff comes out, your research comes out with.
Yeah, I don't have a timeline because with COVID, it's a little hard to plan things, and you don't really know if people are actually going to have their event or not, until they do. So hopefully the paddlers will have a great event this weekend, the Dragon Boat Paddlers. And keep your eye on the schedule of any of these clubs because they update, when they're actually going to do something in person. So it has been a different year, but I didn't want to give up on the topic. It kind of lied a little bit dormant for a while, but I was happy to have a reason to, get back into looking into it. And of course, when I read The Voice in the Boat, and I attended some talks that the author gave about that book,
I realized that this might go on a little bit, especially with the rumor appearing, and a movie may be coming out about that, or based on that book. We'll have to see if that happens or not. But anyway, there certainly is a lot of interest in this, especially in the Olympics this summer. And I was from Seattle, at the age of 19. So I can't wait to really race in person, if that's possible, sometime. There's lots of great people here in the Northwest that love their motor and all this amazing.
All right. Well, then I'm going to say good night. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. And hopefully, so next month, we actually have 2 speaker series for you. So for those of you who are staying virtual, we will have Michael McCutcheon, president of Vancouver USA Pride, for our second part of our series Pride conversations with Clark County's LGBTQ community. And then if it is safe and you are feeling like getting out, we will be at 5440. Brad will be giving a presentation on the Sky River Rock Festival. And 5440 will actually be releasing a new can to commemorate the anniversary of the festival that we have worked with them to put together. So we're looking forward to that. So have a good evening, everyone. Stay safe, stay well, and we'll see you again soon.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.